Welcome to the Exodus Cry podcast.
I wanted to give a short introduction for this podcast today. We're having a guest on, Meghan Murphy, who is the founder and senior editor at feministcurrent.com. We've invited her to be a part of our podcast because we have a very shared common goal of combating the commercial sex industry. For those of our listeners out there who go to feministcurrent.com to check out her website, there may be things that you find there that you disagree with. There may be things that you agree with. There are, I'm sure, a whole bunch of things that you do agree with. And but for our part, I just wanted to say that we feel like it's important to talk with people who we may not agree on every single issue, but we see value in communicating and finding common ground to talk about specific issues that we do share a common view of. And so I want to encourage you not to be put off by things that you may or may not disagree with at Feminist Current. And I hope that in our conversation with Meghan today, that there are things that you will take away from this that continue to help you develop your understanding of the commercial sex industry and how important it is for us to take a stand against it. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Okay, welcome everyone. We have Meghan Murphy with us on the podcast today, and she is somebody who Lila and I have looked up to for a while now related to all the work that we're doing with Exodus Cry. Meghan heads up a news outlet called the Feminist Current, which is probably the most prominent feminist publication that is specifically targeting the sex industry with an abolitionist perspective and continuing to churn out journalism that is on the cutting edge of this issue, the whole conversation around prostitution, the commercial sex industry, and different events that are coming up in the culture around that. And so we're super honored, Meghan, to have you on the podcast with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to talking to you both.
Yes, I echo what Benji said, and I would just add that I quote you all the time. So I'm very excited to be speaking to you live.
Hopefully I'll get you some good quotes.
Yeah, right.
See what I can do.
Awesome. I'd love to, in starting out, to hear just a little bit of your background, Meghan, and how you got started with the Feminist Current and what compelled you to begin to address the issues pertaining to the sex industry. You've got such a clear voice and such piercing language in everything that you write and so many of the other articles that you bring into the Feminist Current. And I'd love to hear just a little bit of your history and your background and how you got started with that.
Yeah, I mean, I did a women's studies degree. I started a women's studies degree just taking like a night class here and there at college when I was around, 19 or 20. It was kind of the only thing that I was really interested in, so I wasn't sure where I was going to go with that. But yeah, as I sort of progressed through my degree, my BA, I also did a master's eventually in gender, sexuality, and women's studies. But as I was just starting my BA and kind of going to school on and off, I was exploring these concepts and the reality of pornography and prostitution. And I really kind of struggled with issues for a long time, especially when I got to university, because university really kind of takes as opposed to college, it's probably different in the U.S. than it is in Canada, but a college is just like a 2-year program, and I find that there's like a lot more diversity in terms of the students. There's older students, there's a lot more working class students, it's cheaper, it's sort of easier to access. A lot of the instructors don't have PhDs, so they're not necessarily academics. They haven't just only been in academia for their entire lives. They've had other jobs. So I just found that approach to women's studies was more grounded in reality than the approach that they tend to take in these super academic university settings, which sort of treats everything an idea and a theory and like something interesting to explore in an essay, rather than, not that we shouldn't be exploring these industries as ideas and writing essays about them, but it really kind of misses the reality portion of what actually happens to women in prostitution and what the real impact of things like pornography and prostitution are on real women and real women's lives. It treats it as sort of like a mind game or like an intellectual exercise or kind of like a postmodernist theory where like maybe we can subvert pornography and make it alternative or make it feminist or, you know, switch roles up so that it no longer is misogynist or it's no longer violent or it's no longer degrading or abusive. But because of that approach in academia, like I doubt that approach myself, you know, like I wanted there to be such a thing as feminist pornography, and I wanted to find the empowerment and the liberation in pornography and prostitution, and I wanted to, you know, look for agency rather than victimization, as I was, you know, encouraged to do in university. So I think a lot of people tend to think that like my opposition to prostitution and pornography and objectification more broadly comes from some kind of like, you know, unwillingness to explore alternative approaches or alternative arguments or just, you know, the other side of things, the so-called sex positive feminist approach to the sex trade. And it's not true, you know, like I really tried to force myself in that direction because it's obviously a lot more comforting. It's a lot easier to, you know, go along with the status quo. It's a lot easier not to feel upset by these things, you know, like I don't want to feel upset by pornography and prostitution and strip clubs. I'd rather, you know, especially when I was younger in any case, perhaps not so much now. I don't really want to fit in so much as I did when I was younger. But when you're younger, you really kind of do want to be one of the cool girls who can like go out to the strip club with the guys and have fun and be into it and, you know, think it's really sexy and like do all the things that your boyfriend wants you to do and not feel like hurt and grossed out and upset by it all. And so I tried to force myself to do that, but this didn't work. Like I did feel upset and hurt and angry and disturbed, you know, to discover that my boyfriend at the time, you know, when I was like 19, 20, was watching pornography. And then, you know, you have those feelings, and those feelings are totally invalidated by larger society, but also often by our partners who will just tell us, you know, we're just jealous, or we should just like relax, or like it's not real, it's just a fantasy, it has nothing to do with you, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, sort of after having those experiences and, you know, going out to strip clubs with like my male friends and at the time and not, you know, it making me feel really upset and uncomfortable, I sort of started to explore the radical feminist arguments against the sex trade more thoroughly and eventually came to the conclusion and I wasn't interested in trying to make excuses for something that shouldn't be excused.
That's so interesting. I didn't realize that aspect of your journey. And so, but I can totally relate to and identify with that. And you're absolutely right from the standpoint that the power that the seductive power that the culture holds concerning kind of the myths around the sex industry and how easy it is to get sort of inoculated into that and just kind of passively accept it as an understanding of our world and the way things are. So what for you would you say was the catalyst or the series of catalysts. You described the situation with your boyfriend at the time. Is there anything else that you would say to elaborate on what things transpired in your life that began to shift you towards a different understanding and towards adopting a radical feminist critique of the sex industry? And it also, I'm just to kind of add one piece onto that question, it might be helpful to distinguish liberal from radical feminism. If there's one thing that I've seen consistently, it's that the term feminist can be triggering to many people, and often with wildly different ideas about what exactly that means. And so, so maybe even speaking to that could be helpful as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because it's like I've been doing a lot of events lately where I'm talking to an audience that isn't necessarily feminist, where there'll be people in the audience who either just don't really know anything about feminism, or they're actually like men who feel that they are opposed to feminism, that they don't like it, that it's like destructive, or, obviously, people who are third wave feminists and haven't really been exposed to radical feminism. But I find like particularly the people who either don't know anything about feminism or think they hate feminism are the ones who come up to me after and are like, I really agreed with most of the things that you said. I thought I didn't like feminism at all, but I think we're like kind of on the same page, which is so funny because especially, radical feminism, I think really freaks people out, that term, because people associate radical with extremist. And I don't actually identify as a radical feminist. I just identify as a feminist, but of course my analysis is rooted in radical feminism, particularly, again, when it comes to things like the sex industry and, of course, things like gender identity. But it's a whole other can of worms. But like radical just means to get at the root. So like liberal feminism, I find, tends to address issues from a really kind of superficial perspective and from a really individualist perspective. So it doesn't necessarily look at broader context. So liberal feminism would say, for example, that pornography is okay if an individual woman who is performing in pornography has chosen it and she's consented. And it won't look at the broader impact of the imagery that's produced in pornography on society as a whole, on men, on women, and won't look at, for example, the reasons why a woman might choose to participate in pornography, why she might need to get into that industry. And same thing with prostitution. Like liberal feminism will maybe say, like, they'll maybe concede, well, yeah, it's bad if somebody is like violently forced into prostitution. But, as long as, there's no force and a woman is choosing to do it, then it's fine and it's none of your business and we shouldn't talk about it. Whereas radical feminism, of course, wants to look at broader context and, again, the broader impact on society, as well as what's happening to actual women in prostitution, whether they supposedly choose it or not. And radical feminism also has like a more complex understanding of choice. So we don't see choice as something that exists in isolation. Of course, people make choices, and of course, people have free will. People make good and bad choices. People make mistakes. People make choices for all sorts of reasons. But, we also want to look at those reasons, like why would a woman go into prostitution? Mm-hmm. Most women in the world don't have any interest in having sex with strange men who don't care about them, so the choice issue is more complex than just making a choice. And of course, most women are going to go into prostitution because they need the money, because they have limited choices. So those are also the things we want to talk about. And so I think that one of the main differences for radical feminism is that we're interested in contextualizing, and we're interested in having larger conversations instead of kind of oversimplifying and painting things in this black and white way that I see happening in liberal feminism.
Totally. I think what you said about radical getting at the root is such a key. And I just want to add my 2 cents and my amen to what you just shared, in saying that I think this framing is extremely important. And I don't think enough value is given to how we're framing this massive industry that is affecting so many millions of lives, and just how passively we've settled for a very shallow analysis of the sex industry that is really just kind of perpetrated or perpetuated by age-old myths that don't have a lot of substance in them. It's bizarre because when I actually try to listen to the other side and what they have to say, it's almost nauseating. It's like so painfully devoid of any real substance, and I just find it bizarre that so much of society has bought into that framework of prostitution, that says this is the world's oldest profession, that this is about women's empowerment, this is about women's sexual liberation, that, all those things that we've heard. It boggles the mind. And so for Lila and I and the work that we're doing, we came face to face with the 7-year-old girl who was being sold in a brothel in Cambodia. We came face to face with the 40-year-old woman who was in her own, different situation here in the United States, and a 17-year-old woman in Moldova. And we began to come face to face in a very kind of front lines way with these injustices that were being done against women, the sexual exploitation, the violation of these women and of their humanity for their use in the sex industry. And when you see that, you can't, it just becomes, it's not, you can't, not only can you not turn a blind eye to it, but at some point you actually begin to say, okay, how do we put an end to this? Because it's not just this one situation and this one person that I care about, although it is that. It's also, okay, there are scores of people in similar situations, and how do we put an end to it? And I think for us, that's what drove us into looking for the resources and the underpinnings to really strengthen and fortify us in our efforts to shift this, to pull this up from the root. And so for us, it was a lot of the radical feminist writings that were such a gift to us in helping to provide that framework. And so again, I just go back to the feminist current. Like, you guys are putting out so many articles that are immensely helpful in building this framework and strengthening and empowering the efforts of abolitionists literally around the world to carry out their work of shifting mindsets, affecting legislation, and just swimming upstream to bring an end to this. So I mean, just kind of on a side note, that's a little bit of our story. But when I talk to people, they hear the word feminist and it sometimes just triggers them. And because, again, they have all these wild notions of what that means. And I always bring it back to, this core fundamental issue for us of like, okay, this is the bedrock of what has provided an analysis for us that's empowering us to carry this out. And then sometimes I'll like people, especially my male friends seem to be very dismissive of any kind of feminist analysis unless it somehow favors them. But so I'll say things like, okay, what about this specific situation of male dominance where women are not even allowed to drive? Do you understand why women would want to organize against that? It's like, well, that's da-da-da-da. I feel like I'm like trying to, it's like, do the simple math.
I mean, the historical and the I find that people really people just are so limited by their own little experiences and their own little bubbles. So I think you're right that a lot of men and even women too will sort of look around them, who live in Canada or maybe the US or whatever, and say, like everything seems fine. Like I don't see any oppression without really understanding. And I mean, this is part of the problem with women's studies departments being destroyed in academia, is that people don't really get a history of women's rights anymore and of the feminist movement. So a lot of people, I think, really just don't realize how hard women had to fight not that long ago in the grand context of things, like not that long ago for basic stuff like the right to vote. But gaining the right to vote was a really big deal. And at the time that women were fighting for the right to vote, people thought they were crazy. They thought that that was too radical of an idea to fight for, and that, you know, these women should be fighting for like more achievable goals. So, you know, and there's a million other examples too, you know, marital rape, which not so long ago was legal, domestic abuse laws and sexual harassment laws. The right of women to like go to university, like it wasn't that long ago. So it's still really important that we, you know, maintain the rights that we have, but then of course continue fighting for the things that we need to fight for. And like you point out, in a lot of countries in the world, women still are oppressed in very overt ways, like in ways that limit their ability to move around and participate in public life.
Totally. Yeah, keeping that historical perspective in mind, I think, is super helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, and I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier about the like positioning the sex trade as liberating, which of course third wave / I kind of go back and forth between using liberal feminism and third wave feminism. I think the analysis is pretty similar, although third wave feminism tends to be understood more in the context of dates, I guess. Like third wave feminism came about in the 90s and is still, as far as I can tell, going on right now, but it is ideological in that it has like a completely different analysis and approach than radical feminism that is similar to liberal feminism. But yeah, I mean, this idea that it could ever be sexually liberating or sexually empowering for a woman to have sex with somebody that she doesn't want to have sex with is so messed up to me and so revealing in terms of how I think we as a society are looking at sex, but particularly the way that modern mainstream feminism is looking at sex. And I think it's really quite disturbing, actually, because, you know, just consenting, like just agreeing to have sex with somebody is not the same as actually wanting to, you know, like if you're in prostitution, you're engaging in sex acts with somebody that you wouldn't otherwise engage in sex acts with, and you're doing it because you need the money. And, you know, I'm not criticizing people for doing things that they don't want to do for money, because most of us do that. You know, most of us go to work, and some people have jobs that are awful and exploitative and degrading. But it's one thing to understand that that's a reality and try to, you know, alter the reality that we live in so that it's better for people and that people can make choices and live lives that are fulfilling and that don't degrade them and exploit them and harm them. But it's another to say that this is a liberating, empowering thing specifically to women, that this would be sexually liberating. I mean, prostitution has nothing to do with female sexuality. It has everything to do with male desire. Men are the ones paying the women to do these things that they don't want to do. And women are doing it because they need the money, or because, of course, they're being trafficked and actually literally forced to. Like, if you wanted to do it, you would just do it. You wouldn't be getting paid for it.
Good point.
Actually, what you just said has been so paradigm shifting for me in being able to critique the sex industry and porn and prostitution as a whole. And it's something I actually read on Feminist Current for the first time. That actually it was an interview with Kaisa Ekman when she was just presenting that scenario of, you know, if you had a woman in the room and you gave her the money, you offered her the money and then asked if she'd stay for the sex and prostitution, of course she would leave, and therefore it's coerced consent. And just being able to understand that kind of analysis of consent and what Yeah. Just how that operates in the sex industry is so foundational and so important to, just the way we understand choice and consent and all of that, when money is what is coercing that choice and that consent. When it was removed, it'd be a completely different scenario. Yeah. So anyway, I appreciate that, and just the way that feminist current has brought even those kinds of concepts to light. And it's been really helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Ty's Ackman's work had a huge impact on me because her analysis is just so solid. Like, her arguments are so strong. And she also did like a ton of research on the Nordic model and prostitution in Sweden. But yeah, like you say, I mean, she's probably the first one that I heard make that argument around, like, if a woman, if two people are really into each other, then there's no exchange of money. There's no need for coercion because both people want to do it. And that's what enthusiastic consent, to borrow a word from liberal feminists, or a term from liberal feminists, means. It means that both people are both interested in doing this and want to be together. It's not about, well, I want this and you don't want it, but how about if I give you $50? Like, that's not enthusiastic consent. That's not real desire. That's not an egalitarian relationship. That's not considering the other person and what they want. Like, why would what kind of person would want another person to have sex with you if you knew that they didn't want to be there? Like, that's weird to me. Like, what is it about these men who are not bothered by the fact that they're engaging in sex acts with somebody that they know doesn't want to do it and doesn't want to be there and isn't interested in them? I mean, that would make me feel so uncomfortable if I were in that position. I would never want somebody to be doing something like that with me who really didn't want to be there and didn't like me and was feeling upset at what was going on. Like, that's not a good feeling. And the fact that so many men in the world can just go through with that and not think twice about it is so disturbing, because it just means people are not exercising empathy. And I don't want to live in a world where people are not empathetic towards one another. Like, that's terrifying.
Right. It gets back to those power dynamics, I guess, where for some men, the thrill is the fact that by virtue of paying for this woman's sexual availability to them, they are then entitled to do whatever they want to her. And to your point about the empathy, we're working on completing another documentary right now on male sex buyers. And of all the men that I asked this question to, I said, so we get deep into the conversation, and it felt like at some point in every one of these interviews, like the right question to ask was, okay, so if you had known that this person was trafficked in the traditional sense, of like abducted somehow, or, whatever, would that have mattered to you? And I was kind of shocked by the level of honesty and transparency of these men, because every single one of them said, no, it would not have mattered. And so
that surprises me too. I would have assumed that they would say, oh, no, that would be a totally different story.
Yeah, you would think so. And yet in kind of these honest moments of self-reflection. And so I think what I took away from that was that there's an intoxication that comes from the power dynamics of the situation that ultimately does have nothing to do with empathy, but is all about serving oneself and enabling oneself to have power over another. And so obviously, the means for that in the prostitution transaction is the money. And but what does that mean for our society? What does that mean for human relationships? And what does that mean for women? Those are the things that we more clear thinking people should be really talking about and discussing. And were you going to jump in? Go ahead and jump in. I was going to steer it back around to feminist current in a second, but I'd love for you to jump in on that point.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was just going to, I think that people based on the way that they approach this issue, which is so we want to talk about these larger issues and these larger ideas and not, just talk about choice as though there's this black and white choice that people make and there aren't other factors and that these industries aren't having a larger impact on society as a whole, and talking about this empathy factor and talking about men's choices and why they're making those choices to favor sex. But I think people just really don't want to think about it. I think that if they had to think about it more deeply and they had to look at the reality of prostitution for what it is, I think it would be so disturbing and troubling that they just don't want to do it. So they just keep turning the conversation around in a way that makes it easier for them to cope. I also think that there are, of course, some people in the world who are kind of just like sociopathic and maybe don't care very much about other people, or who get off on the power of abusing others. But I think that most people that I would encounter in my day-to-day life who want to argue with me about porn and prostitution and tell me that it's no big deal and that everyone does it and, these women are fine, or these women are just women who really like sex, so that's why they're doing this, and want to pretend that it doesn't impact anyone except for the individuals involved in the exchange, or doesn't have any impact on anybody except for, the man watching porn. It doesn't have any negative impacts on the women in porn or those men's partners or anything like that. I think it's just, I think this is a pretty common human response, is that you just don't want to have to think about something so hard that you have to change your life or stop doing something that you like doing or feel bad about something, understanding the reality of prostitution and pornography can just be really overwhelming and upsetting and traumatic. Like, it doesn't feel good to think about all this stuff and to know about all this stuff. But, at the same time, that's part of what was that's what was so upsetting to me, and that sort of put me on the path of wanting to really focus on these issues in my work. Because, it's not like I've never watched porn before. I've seen porn before. And a lot of those images, and the pornography that I've seen was not particularly violent pornography, or it wasn't, particularly abusive. It wasn't like extreme pornography. It was just like regular, like pretty mundane pornography that men would tell me is like no big deal. Then those images are just stuck with me for life. They're in my head for life, and they upset me, and I don't want them to be there. But they are there. And so the fact that I know that, men in my life or boyfriends that I've had, men I've dated, whatever, are watching these imageries, like watching this imagery, like looking at these videos, and not only are okay with it and not disturbed by it, but are turned on by it and using it to like get off on, is so upsetting to me. And so I also get why so many women would just turn a blind eye and be like, I don't want to think about this. I don't want to think about what my partner is watching. I don't want to see what he's watching. I don't want to think about why he's watching it, why he's turned on by this, et cetera, because it's just like, it's too much. Like it's hard. And, it's obviously there's an easier route to take. And I think a lot of people take that easier route.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's so hard to get into the nitty-gritty of what is porn? What is it saying about us? What is it saying about men? What is it saying about women? What is it saying about how they should be treated? And when you actually have to dive into that and analyze it, it can be extremely disturbing. But at the same time, the implications of us not doing it, and the rates of child exposure right now to porn and that being their sex education is so scary and so alarming that I really hope that people are able to start overcoming that tendency to just want to turn away, and that just natural human tendency to want to just take the easier route. And do what you're doing, Meghan, and shining a light on this and actually taking a deep dive to understand it and understand what it's doing to our society and our relationships and to women as a whole and even to men. So, yeah, but I agree. I think that's a big obstacle for people to overcome in this, is being able to just be okay with being disturbed and really open their eyes.
Yeah, well, and I think that a lot of women just feel like there's nothing they can do about it. So, yeah, I think they just feel like, well, I have to accept this, because what else am I going to do? Like, stop dating men? Like, I think that there's so many women in the world who obviously date men or are married to men who use pornography, and and also there's a lot of women in the world who are having like unsatisfying sex with partners who are using pornography, and I don't think that those two things are separate. I don't think that men learn good sexual practices by watching pornography. I think they learn sexual practices that aren't very enjoyable to most women, but and beyond that, often like disrespectful practices or violent practices. But like for women, I think that they're just thinking, well, who am I going to date then? Like we're told over and over, like all men use porn, get over it. And if you're a heterosexual woman and you're interested in having intimate relationships with men, that's like a real challenge, because it just means you have to struggle with your partners in this really upsetting way. Like that's the other thing, right? Is that, like and I'm sure lots of other women have had to have really difficult conversations and arguments with the men in our lives who are supposed to love us. And it's hurtful when you talk to a man who you care about and who is meant to care about you, and he doesn't respect or care about something that's so upsetting or disturbing to you. Like those are hard conversations to have and hard struggles to have over and over and over again, and are quite discouraging when you aren't really validated at all in terms of what you're saying or feeling, and your arguments or your feelings around this aren't respected.
It's such good insight into the struggle for women, especially in dealing with this issue, because like you're saying, if most men are engaging in some way with porn and you have these strong convictions against it, that's going to present a really hard scenario for women who want to have a relationship with men and make it much more difficult. It's so much easier to just adopt that other perspective of just, it's normal, it's liberating, it's empowering, there's nothing wrong with it, it's just spicing up our sex life and da-da-da-da, even though I'm sure most women who even subscribe to that must know deep down that that's not true. But it's so much easier, and it's so helpful for you to point that out, that there's so many different things that are getting in the way of us addressing this appropriately. From like society level, cultural level, down to like, I'm a woman looking for a relationship with a man, and that's going to present a problem for me in having a relationship. So
something.
Yeah. And I mean, I wish that women didn't feel so alone in this. I wish that they had some kind of social support, because when a woman does try to address this with her partner, with a man, he can brush her off and say all those things that, we've talked about, like, oh, it's just a fantasy, like, there's nothing, like, stop being jealous, you just feel threatened by other women or something like that, or, all these other insulting things that just simply aren't true in terms of what most women are concerned about when it comes to pornography. But, like, then we're treated as though it's only us. Like, it's like, oh, you have a problem with this. All these other women don't have a problem with it. All these men don't have a problem with it. Like, the whole world is okay with this except for you. So there's something wrong with you. You're clearly a prude, or you're uptight, or whatever. And yeah, I think what women really need is for other people to be stepping up and saying, like, no, it's not just her, it's also us, and no, this isn't okay. And men too, right? And so I do also really appreciate the work of men who are fighting pornography and prostitution, and talking to other men about it and saying, you know, this isn't good for the women in your lives. Like, it's not even good for men. Like, I think pornography is bad for men. It's bad for women, for sure, but I also think it's bad for men. And I think that we should be talking about that too. It's not good for relationships or for people or for our brains.
Mm-hmm.
I think this all goes back again to the issue of framing and the issue of analysis and just, again, how important that is. Like, if we're going to allow this multi-billion-dollar industry into our society, if we're going to allow this multi-tentacled beast into our relationships, shouldn't we at least take the time to understand what it is that we're allowing and potentially supporting and celebrating and endorsing? And when, you begin to look into the deeper roots or look below the surface of this glacier, so to speak, that goes way, way beneath the surface, it's a very disturbing picture. It's like a root canal. It's like a rotted, the rotted roots. And so I appreciate people like yourself, Meghan, and others who are challenging our notions of what the sex industry is, what pornography is, by providing that deeper level analysis. Because I feel like if we can build a conversation there, then we can move towards more mutuality, more empathy, more egalitarian in our relationship, where there's mutual pleasure, mutual empowerment, mutual caring going on. And apart from that analysis, it does feel like you said, like it's porn is almost used as a club to kind of beat people into submission. It's like, well, this is just accepted, so you should accept it. And I think that's just a shame-based way of approaching relationships, and one that results in, this is the thing I want to say, that results in the taking power away from women. And to me, that's such a core issue when you just look at this across the board. When you break down what pornography is, I mean, virtually every genre of pornography across the board is about taking power away from women in one way, shape, or form. And then you go beyond that to, okay, well, now porn's role in the world. And again, it feels like where it's taking power away from women. And so the guy in the relationship, it jacks up his sex drive to want to do, like one woman told me this guy wanted to do what was called a cherry pie or something like that, where he punches her in the nose and then ejaculates on her face. And I'm just thinking, like, this is so insane. Like, there's no other way to come up with something like that other than you had seen it in pornography. Like, who in the world would ever dream of doing something like that? And but in her situation, it was that the point was like taking power away from her to have a safe, mutually empowering sexual experience. Now it was, you need to comply with this. And I hope for people listening out there that is something that, whether you agree with everything we're saying or disagree with some of what you're saying, that you will begin to understand these dynamics of how the sex industry works to take power away from women. And I don't know. I think that's a point that we all obviously really care about.
Right. Yeah, totally. And I mean, about the way that it belittles women and degrades them and makes them feel small and like nothing. Again, both in terms of what we see men doing to women in pornography, but also in the way that women who speak out about pornography and challenge pornography or try to talk to their partners about it, and are dismissed as crazy or uptight or old-fashioned or sexually repressed or whatever. I mean, it's so belittling and disrespectful.
Totally. Meghan, can I just kind of shift gears for a second here? I was curious, I'm trying to manage our time to make sure that I know we've got just a few more minutes with you, but I wanted to just ask you kind of two more things quickly. One has to do with Feminist Current, and you're kind of the nexus point for survivors, journalists, people of various perspectives who are all wanting to lend their voice, lend their insight and their perspective to this issue. So you being in the middle of that, how do you navigate what kind of content goes up, what kind of content doesn't go up? If you could just talk a little bit about your process and your experience of running Feminist Current, I'd love to get inside your head a little bit on that.
I mean, it's funny because when I started doing Feminist Current, there was all these things I wanted to write about and talk about, and all these things I wanted to interview other women about, and I just needed somewhere to do that. There was really nowhere online, and I still think there kind of is nowhere online where you can focus so heavily and specifically on the radical feminist analysis of prostitution and pornography and gender and violence against women and all that stuff. So I kind of started doing it, not necessarily with any kind of broad plan, and it just turned into what it turned into, and I learned as I went. And a lot of the decisions I make around what we publish at Feminist Current obviously has to do with analysis, but then, of course, there's also a lot of other things like writing. I'm still editing an online magazine, so a lot of it has to do with writing quality and writing ability and forming good, strong, coherent arguments and evidence-based arguments and using evidence and research and resources to support what you're saying and all those other boring things that are really important in terms of producing good content. And then, we try really, really hard to interview as many women. Primarily, we have interviewed a few men here and there, but mostly women who are doing work around the world, activists who are doing work on the ground, who are doing important research, who are producing media, who are taking action, things like that, to be able to highlight their work, but also so that, I don't know everything. So it's really, that's where I've learned so much. I've learned, the bulk of what I feel like I know, I've learned from talking to other women. It's been such an incredible opportunity for me to be able to interview all these women all around the world, to build on my own analysis and to better understand issues and better understand the feminist movement, the history of the movement, and to be able to articulate my own ideas as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. It's been such a gift. Like I said, Lila and I have both really been able to absorb a lot of the articles that have been written related to things that we're working on. And we're just grateful for you guys in this, collaboration. I wanted to, Lila, did you have
I just wanted to ask you, I know that you're on the front lines here talking about issues that are often seen as controversial and going against the grain of the culture and what's acceptable and what's normal in our society. And I know that comes along with a lot of probably attacks and issues that you have to deal with where people are antagonistic against you and your message. And, how do you handle that? Because I know it's a reality for you and other people who are doing what you're doing and really coming against what people find as normal and acceptable and stirring it up.
Yeah. And just to add to that real quick, recently I came under a personal attack that was of kind of a bizarre nature. Like this person just literally just personally went after, like fabricated some lies and like just went on my Wikipedia page and changed a bunch of things. It was bizarre, but it felt so invasive. And that was one thing. But you're sticking your head out there at a whole different level and challenging these power structures and age-old ideas. And I can't imagine the amount of backlash that you get. And so Lila and I both kind of pondered behind the scenes, like, how does she deal with all that attack that must be coming against her?
Yeah, people ask me about that a lot. I never really know what to say.
No.
Like, I'm just kind of used to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like I have a pretty thick skin. Like I think I'm good at not taking attacks personally. I mean, it's really difficult to be lied about all the time. I find that really disconcerting because there's nothing you can do about it. Like there's no accountability. Like the lies that I see about me online are so crazy. Like people will say that they've engaged with me on certain things in certain ways. And I'm like, I've never heard of you before in my life. I've never talked to you before. What are you talking about? People say that I said things that I haven't said all the time, accuse me of all sorts of things. And yeah, you can't, there's so much of it that I could never possibly address it all. Even if I had time, I'd have to spend my whole life tracking people down on the internet and sending them like libel letters or something like that,
Wow.
which really doesn't accomplish that much in the end. But I mean, in terms of the attacks, like it has been stressful and exhausting at times. There was a few years ago this big petition to have me fired from Rabble, which was a leftist site that I used to work for here in Canada. And the petition was started primarily by the sex trade lobby in Canada, a bunch of pro-sex trade groups. And they accused me of all sorts of things. And it was just this constant barrage of attacks online. And it was just tiring more than anything else. It was just so exhausting and it felt never ending. But I mean, in the end, those kinds of things have given me like a pretty thick skin. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but it doesn't get to me that much anymore. And I feel like I would never make an argument, or I would never go online and say something or write an essay about something that I hadn't really thought really hard about. I'm not just saying things off the top of my head that I haven't really thought long and hard about. And so I'm confident in what I'm saying because I've explored these ideas a lot, and I am independent, and so I do have the freedom to say what I want in ways that other people might not. But I also have some accountability to other people. I have accountability to other women in this movement and things like that. And I'm not alone. I don't feel that I'm alone out there. I have good support systems that help. I have a supportive family. I have supportive friends. I've had supportive partners, things like that. So, and I have all these people all around the world who I'm allied with, who I work alongside with, who have been so supportive of me over the years. And so when I do get attacked, there's the attacks, but there's also this like massive outpouring of support from people all around the world. And the support is so much bigger than the attacks. Like the attacks might seem more visible online, but in real life, it's not the case. I don't really get hate mail. Like I probably have gotten a little bit of hate mail, but I've gotten thousands and thousands of positive emails and things. So, I mean, that's sort of why I'm able to continue and why I'm able to do what I do is because of all this support. Feminist Current is really supported. And so I'm really grateful for that, both in terms of people who step up and donate because they know that what we're doing is important and that it's hard and that we don't have other sources of income. We don't have ads on the site. We don't have like these big companies supporting us in the background or anything like that, like every other publication online does practically. But just in terms of really kind of stepping up and offering public support for me and what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, as you know, as people in this space staring at this issue every day, fighting this battle, it can be at times a lonely space. And so, you know, we're just really grateful for an ally like yourself that is just taking such a fierce stance against the expansion of the commercial sex industry and really pioneering work to bring an end to it. So I share Lila's sentiments. Meghan, thank you so much for taking this time to be with us today. And we look forward to staying in touch with you and seeing where things go from here.
For sure. Great. Yeah. Thanks again for doing this podcast. It's been good to talk with you.
Awesome.
Right.
Okay. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. To learn more about how you can be involved, go to exoduscry.com and follow us on social media. If you have questions or comments, email us at feedback@exoduscry.com. We'd love to hear from you.